is connected to the October 9th remote session. And this week is going to be focused on, what might at first glance appear to be a relatively simplistic tool, but that is actually a really powerful process that has so many applications and that you will likely use quite regularly throughout your practical applications of GIS. And the processes I'm talking about here are selections. And I've dropped this note before that, I find if there's really one thing you should try to learn in GIS, it is selections. It's the one sort of proto-analytical tool that can allow you to do, really profound things with your data sets and actually perform some sort of light analysis without ever actually using tools. It's a really good mechanism for organizing large caches of spatial data and winnowing them down so that you can analyze very specific trends. So the first video, I'll mostly just introduce the concept behind selections and sort of what they look like and how it models the data set to which you select. And then in the next videos, we'll dive a little bit more into more advanced ways to select, right? Either by using attributes, the information, or by using location of some spatial object relative to another spatial object. So if you're following along, I've dragged in a data set of crimes and a data set of neighborhoods from the Chicago folder. And to begin, I'll really just come up here to selection, right, which is one of your three big options. It's the manual one. And you can choose any one of these you want. They'll do what you describe. You could do a circle. You could do freeform. Most commonly used one is probably rectangle. And I'll grab it and just sort of drag down and try to select some neighborhoods and some points. And, what will happen is sort of a mess of coloration. Now, I dragged this little square here, right? And therefore, it selected every point that was in it. And the neighborhoods themselves appear to have slightly larger boundaries, but that's only because that's how large the neighborhoods are, right? So a select will work with anything you touch. So I touched this neighborhood, and even if I only touched it in this lower left corner here, right corner, it selects the entirety of the neighborhood. So visually, what do you see when you select? Well, the objects that you selected become sort of like a fluorescent blue. Analytically, we need to open the attribute tables of both of these to actually see what has happened to the data and how it will mess with how we interact with it. So I'm just going to open both of the attribute tables. I'll sort of drag this up a little bit. All right, so if I'm in neighborhoods, I can see at the bottom it's going to tell me I have 5 of 98 selected, right? What that means is there are 98 neighborhoods in this data set, and I have 5 of them that are selected. Now, we can't see them right now. We might be able to if we scroll down. There they are. There's a couple of them selected. And that's just because the default view you're often in your attributes is this thing down here that says Show All Records. Once you've begun selecting, you do have the option to move back and forth between the two. And that's sort of a neat concept right there, right? I can look at my selections, and I can look at everything with my selections, and I can look at my selections. The same would be true with crimes, right? I have 772 selected, and I can sort of move back and forth between viewing those crimes that I selected and the remainder of my data set. The other things to be aware of, and I'll do this on neighborhoods to make it easy, the moment you select, you get some elements that pop up here that tell you there's more you can sort of do with your data. Right? Zoom to is a relatively obvious concept. It will sort of focus in on the areas you have selected. That's a nice way if you sort of want to hone in on something. You select it and zoom to it, and you'll go right to it. Switch is a pretty cool concept as well. This is called inverse selecting. So the way switch would work is that if what you have selected is what you don't want, you would hit switch and everything else becomes selected and you can switch right back. Do not mess with these two. These two should only be done when you are in the editing window, because literally what you would do, and it'll remind you, it'll say, you sure you want to do that, is delete those records or copy them, right? So either what I'd be doing here is making duplicate neighborhoods for copy, or I'd be getting rid of them. So definitely useful when you're editing and you actually do need to pare down a data set or remove some information. But for right now, you sort of want to avoid them. The last thing that you can do here is you can also come to clear, which is sort of an interesting concept as well. But I'll do that on the crimes just to make them a little bit less messy. And clear really means clear the selection. Now, you can see why that would be appropriate now because we don't want it selected anymore. But in a few minutes, when we start to see the ramifications of selecting and what it means for analytics, that concept there of deselecting, of clearing, is going to become far more important. And just memorizing that you need to do that will obviate you from screwing up over and over again. And trust me, I still do the same thing because selections pare down the data such that whatever selected is the only thing that will process. I'll show you in a bit. If we do a field calculator, it's only going to be with the selections. If we export, it's only going to be with the selections. Later on, when we learn to do tools and analytics, it would only be with the selections. So that's why keeping clear in the back of your mind is a good strategy. Don't keep things selected unless you intend to. The other thing I want to show you here in the neighborhood is this idea here called highlighted. Highlighted is best thought of as a selection of a selection. So if I were to select new city, it will show up yellow here and it will show up yellow on my map. Right? I can pick 4 of them. And the neat thing is I can then engage with that. I can unselect those, right? So the highlighted ones would disappear and only Marquette Park Gardens would stay, or Gage Park. I could reselect, which is what I'll do in a second. And when I reselect, it would be Gage Park that would leave, right? So I'm selecting from a selection. And same thing previously, right? I can sort of switch between the selections as I did before. So, but if I reselect, right, it'll get rid of Gage Park because it wasn't in yellow, and only those ones will be selected. So highlighting, selecting from the selections. The last thing I'm going to do, and if you want to follow along, you just kind of create an add field. It's going to be relatively simple. And we'll actually just call the field cheese, to show sort of an example here. Whenever I use that word, it means I don't really care what the field's going to be. So cheese, it's going to be a text, 255 characters. Come on up and save here at the top of the screen. If you don't see this, make sure the Fields tab is clicked. Now, I did this only because I want us then to right-click cheese and go to Calculate Field. And down here where it says cheese, we are literally going to say cheese equals double quote cheese. Now, it is not going to look like much occurred at first. It's going to do what we have been trained to expect it to do from several weeks ago when we first learned about field calculators. But if I switch back to the showing of all records, I can see what I've really accomplished here. I entered the word cheese, but it only changed what was selected. And this concept is super important for you to build into your muscle memory. Any piece of data that is selected will be the only thing that processes. So when you are running analytics and doing buffers in a few weeks, or running density, or any tool that we learn, and it appears to only be doing it for a subsection of the data, what that means is you have an active selection. So it's just a good reason to be coming up and hitting clear when you're done with it. But I'm not going to hit clear quite yet because there's one last thing I want to show you in this introduction video before we get into some more advanced concepts. Right-click Chicago Neighborhoods, go to Selection, and you'll see some of the same options that we have in the attribute table and at the top of the screen. Further evidence of what I've been saying, how ArcPro really lets you choose the best pathway to navigate through your data. However, in typical ArcPro fashion, there is a super cool and super useful process hidden in the depths of a right click. And it is this one here that says Make Layer from Selected Feature. I'm going to do it. I'm going to right-click the neighborhood selection that came and change the color so as not to confuse it. And then I'm going to come up to clear the selection. So what have I done? Well, I've taken what I had selected and I made a layer out of it. I can open its attribute table and I will see that it is only the 4 that I had selected previously. Now let's talk about what this means. Did I make a new piece of data? Did I make a new shapefile or a new feature class? No, I did not. It's almost the same equivalent if I were to copy something and then right-click the map and do paste. I'm just making another visual layer, another way of viewing the data. I'm not saving new data, I'm not creating new pieces. And I can check that in sort of 2 ways. And I could go to Properties, and if I were to look at the source, it's still going to tell me it's coming from my Mac home desktop October 9th Chicago test, right? Chicago neighborhoods. It's still telling me this is where I came from. That's my origin. I'm rooting back to that. I'm just a copy of it. And that's also important because if I come up here to Chicago neighborhood selection, right? Not the neighborhoods anymore, the selection. And I do the same thing where I calculate in cheese. And maybe now I call it triangle. I don't know why that word popped in my head. All is going to be as we expected here, right? The word will become triangle. But now if I open Chicago neighborhoods and scroll down, or I could just sort by setting, it's triangle. So that's a profound concept. I didn't touch Chicago neighborhoods. I didn't right-click this layer and hit Calculate Field. I did all of it within here, within the attribute table of the selection. But that's the point that we are making. When you use that process, when you have something selected and you say, hey, I don't want to be viewing you alongside non-selected data. I'd like you to become your own layer, which is a very common thing to do. But when you do it, you are still linked back to the original source. So if you do anything to the attributes in that selected layer right here, it will find its way back to the original data as we saw with the triangle example. So those are the basics with selections, right? That's how it looks visually. You highlight fields in order to be able to isolate and perform actions that only work for those fields. But just doing it manually will only allow you to get so far with selections. And the real power is not just visually picking things out, but using the information or using where something is located to perform the same sort of analytical selections.